Okay, The Wife of Bath's prologue, lines 587 onwards. The key images in the next extracts we're going to look at are her husband's funeral. He dies quickly, and there's situational comedy. The humour of this scene. She uses her horoscope and the use of planetary influence, and then she uses this brilliant imagery of how she's generous with her chamber of Venus. So, Alison's fourth husband dies conveniently quickly, so she is free to pursue Jankin even at his funeral. She makes a great show of grief, but her widow's veil allows her to secretly admire Jankin's shapely legs and feet as he follows the coffin. The wife is in love for the first time with a man literally half her age. And what's interesting is we have a slightly more individual story about the wife rather than kind of the anti-female sources we've used before. And the battle stops momentarily as she speaks of her genuine feeling for this very young man. And she then goes on to digress and talk about how she is influenced by the planets. Let's carry on. While that my fourth husband was on bier. Now I've drawn a little picture there, by the way, of a funeral bier. So he is a corpse on a plank with legs. Funeral bier. So, when that my fourth husband was on bier, I weep algate and made sorry cheer, as wives mooten, for it is usage, and with my coverchief covered my visage. But for that I was purveyed of a make, I wept but small, and that I undertake. Okay, so, when my fourth husband was on his funeral bier, I wept continuously and made sorry appearance, as wives must. But I used my coverchief, the cloth for covering her head. I covered my face, and I was so she's making sure she was provided with a mate. So I wept just a little. So she makes sure that she doesn't weep too much, so she still looks good, and she's talking about using her veil so she can continue to look attractive, and she is going to make sure that she looks out for her own interests in order to provide her with a mate. And this, of course, leads to this brilliant image and the situational comedy. To church was mine husband born a morrow, with neighbours that for him made in sorrow, and Jankin our clerk was one of those. As help me God, when that I saw him go after the bier, methought he had a pair of legs and of feet so clean and fair, that all mine heart I gave unto his hold. He was, I true, 20 winter old, and I was 40, if I shall say sooth. But yet I had alway a colt's tooth. Gat-toothed as I was, and that became me well, I had the print of Saint Venus' seal. And this is absolutely brilliant. There's a coarseness in the way she speaks. It is very coarse. And she does talk so openly about her lusty character that it is a little, it does border for, even as a modern audience, on shocking. She talked about not wanting to splash out on his burial, and her description of him is unpleasant, and she makes up the kind of threads of the story. But she does talk openly about the fact that at his funeral she's busy plotting her next husband and admiring this young man. So an audience of the time, she's amusing, she's shocking, but she's clearly following the stereotype. So, and I've drawn a little picture there of Jankin and his lovely legs. So I'll go through this in modern English now. To church my husband was taken in the morning, with neighbours who made sorrow for him, who were making sorrow for him. And Jankin, our clerk, was one of those. So she's astounded. Look at the exclamation. When I saw him go after the bier, methought he had a pair of legs and of feet, so clean and fair, that all my heart I gave unto his hold. So his legs were so fine and shapely, I gave him my heart completely unto his hold. He was, I'm truthful, or I know, 20 years old, and I was 40. I'll tell the truth. But I always had a colter's tooth, so a youthful desire, or youthful desire and inclination, a fondness for young men. Gap-toothed was I, so gap-toothed, and of course, which suggests she found men attractive. Gap-toothedness was lustiness or flirtatiousness. Gap-toothed was I, and that became me well. It suited me to be gap-toothed. I had the print. I had the mark of Venus. I was sealed, Venus's seal upon me. As help me God, I was lusty oon, and of my tongue a very jangleress, and walk I would, as I had doon before from house. I've just made a mistake, so I apologise. I'll just go over the page between 53 and 54 again. As help me good, I was a lusty oon, and fair and rich and young and well begun. And truly, as mine husband has told me, I had the best quonium might be. And we'll come to that in a moment over the page. But very important, a 40-year-old woman lusting after a young man. There's a sentimental side to Alison. It also builds tension because we want to hear what happens. It foreshadows the tale, so the idea of mastery over woman and kind of mastery and the power struggle between men and women. You've also got the irony of an older woman and a younger man that foreshadows the tale. And the second irony is that now she is the old, marrying the young, when for the first three husbands, she was the young, marrying the old. And you've got this reversal, which is so key to this fifth marriage. Now, he is the young one, she is the old one, she has to win him, and we've got this great reversal from the first three husbands to the fifth. Now we've just got this brilliant transfer between page 53 and 54. I was a lusty oon, and fair, and rich, and young, and well begun, and truly, as mine husband has told me, I had the best quonium might be. And of course that is absolutely hilarious. She has the best thingamabob her husband's told her. So she has the prettiest bits that ever might be, and her husband's told her. And so we've got this brilliant, she's honest about herself. I was fair, I was rich, I was young, I was well fixed, so she's got money. And truly, my husband's told me I had the best bits they'd ever seen. And then she goes on to talk about her influences. So, in feelinge and mine heart in Marcian. Oh, I apologise, I've missed a line. For certes, I am all Venerian. In feelings and mine heart is Marcian. Venus gaf me my lust, my licorousness, and Mars gaf me my sturdy hardiness. Mine ascendant was Tor, and Mars therein. Alas, alas, and ever love was sin. I followed my inclination, by virtue of my constellation, that made me I could not withdraw my chamber of Venus from a good fellow. Now, it's absolutely brilliant. Now, you'll need to look at your notes for the back of this, but the wife is born under the zodiac sign of Taurus, where the house of Venus was rising. Mars was also present. And what's interesting is you do have the kind of incompatible sides of her nature, which I've put in the green, facing the wrong way, on the left-hand side of your page. There are the incompatible sides of her nature. The pleasure-seeking, but also the promiscuous. So you have it's very overtly aggressive sexual language. She talks about her genitalia. She's aggressive, she's domineering, her language is astonishingly provocative, and she goes on to talk about the imagery of which star sign she's influenced by, and so have a look at that in your notes. And then in the middle, alas, alas, oh, that ever love was sin. I followed my inclination. So, oh, alas, it is that it's a sin. And of course, she then goes on quickly to say, but I followed my inclinations by virtue of my constellation. So she follows her inclinations because of her stars, and which stars she's influenced by, not by what the church taught as purity. Very important. She glories in the anti-woman idea. This is the purple on the right-hand side. She glories in the anti-woman idea of women being insatiably drawn to sex. And she says that she's drawn to this because of the constellations, because of the stars, not because of the teaching she's received from the medieval church. And of course that's so shocking, absolutely shocking. The partner, of course, is present, but it's also very amusing. And she does disappear behind a stereotype. We saw her as vulnerable for a moment, and now, of course, Chaucer goes back to presenting her as a stereotype, and this stereotype is her horoscope. Despite her earlier protestations she was always faithful to her husbands, she now tells us that she always followed her appetite, and that she'd never withdrawn her chamber of Venus, and it is dangerously ambiguous here. So she moves from claiming to only have dalliance, but as the prologue goes on, she moves more towards admitting infidelity in a very shocking way. Her sexual language continues, the humour continues, but the new stereotype is that she uses her planetary influence. And of course her chamber of Venus, well, there's a phrase. Yes, so I could not withdraw my chamber of Venus from a good fellow. So she follows her desires. She couldn't stop herself from giving her chamber of Venus to a good fellow. And we've moved from earlier in the tale when she talks about dalliance to really quite shocking. Yet have I martyr's mark upon my face, and also in another private place. For God so wise be my salvation, I never loved, never by no discretion, but ever followed mine appetite. Alwa he short, or long, or black, or white, I take no kip. So that he liketh me, how poor he was, nay eke of what degree. So, very important, I have a mark upon my face of Mars, but also in another private place. So very, very shocking language. So the idea of a birthmark in a very private place. So God be my salvation, I never loved in moderation, but ever followed my appetite. Of course, sexual appetite. I don't mind if he's short or long or black or white. I took no notice, provided that he pleased me. How poor he was, or of what rank. So really very shocking. We've got to a dangerous point of her language. She admits she cannot love in moderation. She says she's led by her appetite. So this is the high point really of her admission of her sex and her sexual desires determining her actions. What should I say? But at the month's end, this jolly clerk Jankin, that was so hend, hath wedded me with great solemnity, and to him have I all the land and fee that ever was me given there before, and afterwards me repented me full sore. He nolder suffer nothing of my list. Okay, what should I say? But at the end of the month, Jankin, who was so courteous, he wedded me with great solemnity, and to him I gave all the land and property. So ironic. Do you remember when she complained that her husbands wouldn't give them the keys to her chest? They wouldn't give her the keys to their chests, and she then withdraws her sexual favours until they give her their money. And now this has come full circle, and the reversal is very clear. The structural reversal. She is the old fool now. Afterwards repented me full sore. So she gives him all the land and a property that was ever given me before, and afterwards repented me full sore. I repented it, because he would not allow me anything of my desires. He nolder suffer nothing of my list. And so amusing, isn't it? But quite it does inspire us with kind of pathos. We feel pity for her, because of course what's interesting is he won't do anything she wants. But on line 408, there would I chide and do him no pleasance. I would no longer in the bed abide, if I felt his arm over on my side till he had made his ransom unto me. Then would I suffer him to do his nicety. So the power that she wielded over her former husbands is now being wielded over her. And she then recounts his physical violence to her. By God, he smote me once on the list, for that I rent out of his book a leaf, that of the stroke mine ear wax all deaf. So, by God, he hit me once on the ear when I tore a leaf out of his book, when I tore a page out of his book. And that stroke of my ear became all deaf. And now she talks about her being stubborn as a lioness. He's not pleased with her. And what we're about to discover is he wants to stop her going on pilgrimage, stop her going from house to house and gossiping, and generally stop all of her past behaviour. He beats her when she tears a page from his book and is constantly quoting stories to her about husbands who left their wives because they would not do as they were told. Now we see she suffers the woe in her marriage that up until now she has caused. She's always been at a distance from the anti-woman literature, but now she not only has to hear it, but she also has to endure the physical experience of it. So she's had this kind of barrage of misogyny from previous husbands and from society and from the medieval church. But now not only does she have this misogyny preached to her by her husband, but she also has the physical violence. She talks in the moment at this last line of the page, as stubborn as she was as a lioness, and we'll carry on, so I'll carry on over the page. Stubborn I was as a lioness, and of my tongue a very jangleress, and walk I would as I had done before, and from house to house, although he had it sworn, for which he oftentimes would prech, and me of old Roman justice teach, how he of Simplicius Gallus left his wife, and here forsook for term all of his life, naught but for open heaved here, he here say, looking out at his door upon a day. So I was stubborn as a lioness, and my tongue was very jangleress, so a chatterbox. I was a chatterbox, and walk as I would, as I'd done before, from house to house, although he had sworn to the contrary. So he had said that I would not. He'd sworn that I was not allowed to. He stopped her walking. He wanted to stop her walking from house to house. So oftentimes he would preach and teach me of old Roman stories about how Simplicius Gallus left his wife and forsook her for the rest of his life, for nothing, naught, for nothing except of he saw her bareheaded looking out of the door. So the idea is that he saw her without her wimple on. He left her and wouldn't go back to her for the rest of her life just because she looked out of the front door without her headscarf on. Another Roman told he by name that for his wife was at a summer's game without his whiting, for he sook heroic. Eke and then would he upon his Bible seek that eke proverb of Ecclesiastes, where he commandeth and forbadeth fasting, man shall not suffer his wife to go rule about. Then would he say right thus without doubt, whoso that buildeth his house all of sallows, and pricketh his blind horse of other fallows, and suffereth his wife to go seeking howers, is worthy to be hanged on the gallows. But all for naught, I set a knot on how of his proverbs, nay of his old say, nay I would not him of corrected be. So let's go through that. Another Roman told he be by name that his wife was at a midsummer revel, and without his knowledge, so he forsook her also. So he tells a story about a Roman who, because his wife went to a midsummer revel without his knowledge, he forsook her also. And then he would look in his Bible, he would seek in his Bible that proverb of Ecclesiastes, where he commands and strictly forbids that a man should allow his wife to go wandering about. And he would say this: whoever builds his house of willow twigs, and spurs his blind horse over the open fields, and allows his wife to go on pilgrimages, is worthy to be hanged on the gallows. So allowing your wife to go on pilgrimages is the same as building your house with twigs, or spurring a blind horse over open fields. You should hang yourself. So this is really vociferous misogyny. And this is an anti-woman rhyme. You can see it in the quotation marks. And this is the woe in marriage. If you allow your wife to do all these things, then you should be hanged. And this is the anti-woman literature of the time being used against her. The marriage, the liaison, the dalliance now becomes acrimonious. He abuses her physically and verbally once he's obtained control of all her goods, and she fully intends to continue acting as she has before. So we do see her stubbornness, but she does have to defend herself. She's defending herself against him, against ancient scholarship, against the anti-woman literature of the time, and she resents his criticisms. And she suggests that all women must feel the same. And she then says, "Nay, I would not of him corrected be. I hate him that my vices telleth me, and so do more, God wot, of us than I." So I hated him when he corrected me. So I hated being corrected. I hate him who tells me my vices, and so do more of us, God knows, of us than I. She seems to suggest that women all feel this. We don't want to be corrected, and she's really speaking, I suppose, to a kind of a more of a female representative and saying that this is the way all women feel. And so she carries on. She refuses to be corrected, and as you see in my note, she didn't care, and he is furious. "This made him with me woot all out really. I nolde not forbear him in no case." So this made him angry with me, utterly angry. I would not put up with him in any way. So I wouldn't forbear with him in any way. Now she tells us about the book she tore. Now, actually, I'll talk to you about that first. Jankin had a book which he would read whenever he had a spare moment. It was a collection of some of the best-known authors of the Middle Ages, and Alison hates the book, and she calls it the Book of Wicked Wives. And these were stories that all condemned women. She despises the male scholars who wrote it, and she says, as we're going to look at in the extract, these old men don't understand women. They are the ones who write the stories. And she says that they are so old, they are essentially unable to perform sexual acts, and therefore they write unpleasant stories about women. She says if women were doing writing, there would be plenty of tales about men. Now, in this sense, Chaucer is quite astonishing for his time. All the authors that the wife has been quoting and have been quoted at her, she's been fighting against them and twisting them in her own defence. They now appear in Jankin's Book of Wicked Wives. And what's interesting is she demands to know a little later who painted the lion. That is on line 692. Who portrays us this way? And it's a key question, because in medieval literature, and in fact art, literature, religion, work, family life, it was all controlled by men. You know, literature was written by men, and it raises a very, very forward-thinking question, in a time that was so patriarchal. So let's carry on. "Now will I say you sooth by St. Thomas, why that I rent out of his book a leaf, for which he smote me so that I was deaf." Now I'll tell you, by St. Thomas. This is the pilgrim shrine of St. Thomas a Becket at Canterbury. So I'll tell you, she swears by St. Thomas, why I rent out of his book a leaf, for which he hit me so hard that I was deaf. And she's about to say he had a book full gladly that he used as his amusement. Disport means amusement, that he would read alway. So he had a book that gladly, night and day, for his disport, he would read alway. And I'll go over the page. There's a break between slides. He clepted Valerie and Theophrastai, at which book he laugh alway full fast. And eke there was some time a clerk at Rome, a cardinal, That hight Saint Jerome, that made a book against Jovinian, in which book eke there was Tertullian, Crispius, Trotula, and Eloise, that was abbess not far from Paris. And eke the parables of Solomon, Ovid's art, and many bookes many on. And all these were bounden in a volume, and every night and day was his costume, that he had, when he had leisure and vacation from other worldly occupation, to read an honest book of wicked wives. He knew of them more legends and lives than being of gooder wives in the Bible. For trusteth well, it is an impossible that any clerk will speak good of wives, but if it be of holy saints' lives, nay, none other woman never the more. Who painted the lion? Tell me who. Now, his book is a collection of some of the best-known authors of the Middle Ages, and of course this is his idea of fun. So when he has any leisure, so I'll go through this now in the modern, so he called it Valerie and Theophrastus, a book which he always laughed heartily or eagerly, and also a cardinal, a clerk at Rome, so someone who learned at Rome, a cardinal who's called Saint Jerome, who made a book against Jovinian. And of course Jovinian suggested that to be married was equal to virginity in the eyes of God, and Saint Jerome wrote in absolute abhorrence of this idea. He wrote his letter against Jovinian, saying Jovinian's idea that marriage was equal to virginity was completely wrong, that etc. And we've talked about that before. And there's also Tertullian. And Tertullian was an early Christian who wrote in praise of chastity, monogamy, and modesty. Tertullian. Chrysippus was condemned by Saint Jerome for suggesting that people ought to marry. Trotula was a female physician, so she was a female doctor. She was thought to be a midwife. These are all notes in the back of your book, in the back of your James Winney edition. She was an expert on the bodies and ways of women. And what's interesting is that these are all mentioned in this book of Wicked Wives and used then to suggest that any view other than the view that women were hideous, sexually driven, impossible to live with, and Chrysippus, for example, is mentioned by Saint Jerome. And Saint Jerome says that it's absolutely absurd of Chrysippus to advise a wise man to marry. So Saint Jerome could not abide the idea that it was okay to marry. Trotula, of course, was thought to be a midwife and a gynecologist, female, and she knew about feminine passions and diseases of women. And Heloise was a secret wife of the great teacher and priest Abelard, and so she was the secret wife of a Roman Catholic priest, and she later became prioress of a convent, and so she's also in Roman de la Rose. So you've got this book full of teachings complaining about women. Ovid's Art is a book about love by Ovid. And so this is full of stories that are then twisted to be anti-woman. He knew of more legends and biographies of these anti-woman notions than of good women in the Bible. He knows more about this negative view of women than of good women. And she says, for trust as well, it's impossible that a clerk could speak well of wives. She's saying that anyone who's learned speaks badly of women. And so Clark, she now really is criticizing the learning of the day. So it's true, it's for trust well, it's an impossibility that any clerk would speak well of women unless it be of holy saints' lives, nor of any other woman in any way. The only positive thing they'd say about women is if they were holy saints' lives. Who painted the lion? Who painted the lion? And this powerful rhetorical question shows her really questioning the learned nature of the day, the monastic orders, the religious orders of the day that would educate men to be anti-women. And what's interesting is this question is really her anger. She's incensed, she's furious by these notions, these anti-women notions. And so she's really asking this question because it really, for the first time in her prologue, it directly affects her. This is the woe. She is under a marriage of conflict, and it's very important. So let's carry on. By God, if woman had written stories as Clarkes han within her oratories, they would han written of men more wickedness than all the mark of Adam may redress. The children of Mercury and of Venus, being in her working full contrarious, Mercury loveth wisdom and science, and Venus loveth right and dispense. Now, let's have a look at that. So she's saying now, all the writers that she has been arguing against, if women were so criticised, so if women wrote books, they would find plenty of tales to help illustrate the wickedness of men, that all more than Adam and all the male sex could set right. If women wrote stories just like clerks have written their oratories, their studies, they would have written of men more wickedness than all of the male sex could set right. The children of Mercury, so clerks, and Venus, lovers, are in direct contrary in their actions. So they work in full contrariness. So the children of Mercury, the clerks, and those of Venus, the lovers, are in direct contradiction of one another. Because Mercury loves wisdom and knowledge, and Venus loves riot and extravagant expenditures. So they are bound to clash. And she now really openly voices the clash, the opposition of the most powerful planets, Venus and Mercury. But what's interesting is the idea that there are no winners. That's the other interesting thing, is they are clashing, there's a war, there's a conflict, but there are no winners. And let's carry on. And for her diverse disposition, falleth in others' exaltation. So I'll go over the page and then we'll carry on. And because of their diverse dispositions, because they're so different, each falls in that other's most powerful astronomical sign. So the idea, when one planet is highest in the sky, another is desolate, the idea of this power struggle, neither wins. What's interesting is the sense that neither wins in these next few lines. And thus God knows, Mercury is desolate in Pisces, where Venus is exultant, and Venus falleth there, Mercury is raised. Therefore no woman of no clerk is praised. So she's saying when one planet is at its highest point, another is fallen. When the other one is high, the other one's fallen. And so therefore is no woman praised by any clerk, because Mercury and Venus are never in the same place. Mercury and Venus, the clerks and the lovers, or scholars and women, are never going to be in the same place. So they are never, women will never be praised, because they are never going to be in alignment. She then goes on to say, the reason why clerks write in this way is because they are old. And they're too old to be able to enjoy sexual pleasure, cross-referenced, by the way, with lines 572 coming up. And she says that they are so old, they sit down and write because they're in their dotage, and they write about how women can't stay faithful in marriage. Let's look at this now. The clerk, when he is old, and may not do of Venus works worth his old shoe, then he sit down and write in his dotage that woman cannot keep him marriage. So, the clerk, when he's old, and may not do the making love, so he cannot make love. He's so old he can't make love. So he can't do Venus's works worth an old shoe, and that lovely colloquial expression, wasn't worth a leek. The mouse's heart wasn't worth a leek, and it's not worth an old shoe. So he can't do his work of Venus. He can't make love. Not worth an old shoe. So he sits down and he writes in his old age that women cannot keep their marriage vows. They cannot be faithful. But now to my purpose. So we go to the point, the night of the fight, as I've put in the margin there. She now recounts what book Janken read to her. And it's 10 examples and then a list of women's vices. So, but now to purpose why I told her thee, that I was beaten for a book, pardie. Upon a night Janken, that was our sire, read her on his book as he sat by the fire. O vive, Eve, first, that for her wickedness was all mankind brought to wretchedness. Yes, that's right, excuse me. For which that Jesu Christ himself was slain, that bought us with his heart a blood again. So he starts with Eve. Okay, so we get the idea of him sitting by the fire on a nightly basis. That night Janken, who was master of our house, read from the book as he sat by the fire of Eve first, for how her wickedness all mankind was brought to wretchedness because of her actions, for which Jesus Christ himself was slain, who brought us back with his heart's blood. And he insists on reading it aloud. He doesn't just read it himself. He reads aloud the story of Eve, who ate the apple in the Garden of Eden. For this, he says, this was why Jesus was killed, and all humanity suffered. And this is just the beginning of a long list of wives who betrayed, humiliated, and murdered their husbands. Some wives managed all 3 together, murdering their husbands and having sex with a lover while the corpse lay on the floor. Some merely preferred to drive nails into their husband's brain. And this is lengthy, but he's only using a fraction of the stories that he could have used from the medieval anti-woman tradition. Nevertheless, the wife and the audience have had enough. Some of the horrors are memorable, and it's really, really shocking. We move from the most open kind of discussion about her sexual revelations, her chamber of Venus, into the most horrifying accounts of what these women are said to have done to these men, and the blame that Janken therefore feels that all women should suffer. And we really feel this incredibly unpleasant description, and that we will continue in the next PowerPoint.